I want you all to picture for just a minute that you're at an Olympic dive meet. Imagine the enthusiasm in the air and the smell of chlorine that's probably burning your nostrils. It's the finals and there's only 2 more divers left. As you watch the first diver jump off the platform, you witness a simple yet very elegant dive that was really flawless in nature. And this is apparent because when he hit the water, there was no splash whatsoever. The next diver, just like the first, jumps off the platform, and this time he performs an even more difficult dive. However, as he approaches the water, a slight mistake was made, and this was apparent in how he hit the water. So who deserves to win? Now, if you're like me, and I would remind you I'm not an Olympic judge, but if you're like me, you might make the assumption that the first diver deserves to win because his dive was flawless. And here's the lesson. Olympic judges not only judge a dive based off of how graceful it looks to the public, but they also take into account the difficulty of the dive. Now, how often do we judge others based on their physical appearance or based off of somebody's outward behavior without taking into account perhaps the difficulty of the challenges or trials they're faced with? I once saw a quote that said, if the shoe fits, it's ugly. And I would add, if it's ugly, then get rid of it. And I believe one way to get rid of that ugly shoe we tend to put on so frequently is through a better understanding of what is known as behavioral genetics. Now, I realize I say behavioral genetics, and a lot of you probably start zoning off. But bear with me, and I promise you that this understanding of behavioral genetics will change your life. And it will specifically change how you view others. I want to talk about 3 things in specific. The first being what exactly behavioral genetics is. The second being what do the studies in behavioral genetics teach us. And lastly, how this understanding of behavioral genetics should change the way we view others and ourselves. So what exactly is behavioral genetics? Put simply, behavioral genetics is the study of how genetics affects behavior. Now, what's really interesting about behavioral genetics, in order to study this, what they do is they actually follow twins that were separated at birth and adopted into different families. And they follow these twins and see how similar they end up, even though they were put in different environments. So what exactly do these studies teach us? I want to talk about 3 specific studies that specifically focused on 3 different behaviors. The first study was performed by Professor Slutsky and his colleagues, and they looked at a specific gene variant that was associated with violent behavior. And what's interesting is they actually concluded that violent behavior was accounted for 50% by genetics. The second study I want to talk about was a study performed by Professor Garcia. Professor Garcia and her colleagues were looking at a gene variant associated with promiscuous behavior. And they concluded that promiscuous behavior was in fact accounted for 30 to 40% by genetics. The last study I want to talk about is a study that was done by Professor Langstrom and his colleagues. And they focused on a gene variant associated with homosexual tendencies. What's interesting about this conclusion was they decided and they concluded based on the evidence that homosexual tendencies are actually accounted for 35% by genetics. So what does this teach us and how should this affect us? For starters, we should be way more patient with ourselves and with others as we come to realize that our natural tendencies are completely different than the natural tendencies of the person sitting next to us. Or in other words, our mountains that have been given to us are completely different than the mountains other people are climbing. And I would add to that, people need help climbing their mountain. And they don't need people to remind them how far they still have to go. In conclusion, I, for one, am grateful that the one person who will judge us in the last day not only looks at how flawless our dive was, and he doesn't look at how graceful our dive might look to public, but he also takes into account the difficulty of our dives. Dr. Seuss once said, "Kids, you'll have mountains. Today is your day. Your mountain is waiting, so get on with your way." Thank you.